The blood from Zelda Crawford's cracked knuckles dripped into the bucket of soapy water, turning it faintly pink as she scrubbed the saloon floor on her hands and knees in the sweltering California heat of 1878. She had been working at the Golden Rose Saloon in Paso Robles for 3 years now, ever since her father died and left her with nothing but debts and a name that meant less than dust in this unforgiving town. And every single day her hands grew more raw, more torn, more unrecognizable as the hands of the girl who once dreamed of playing piano in a fine San Francisco parlor. Zelda was 22 years old, though she felt ancient most days, her back aching from the endless hours of bending and scrubbing, her knees bruised purple from the hard wooden floors, her fingers so stiff some mornings she could barely straighten them. The saloon owner, a cruel man named Bartholomew Stone, paid her barely enough to afford a tiny room above the general store, and even that was only because his wife had convinced him that having a woman sleep in the saloon would be improper. Zelda suspected Mrs. Stone simply did not want her husband having easy access to a young woman at night, though Stone had never touched her in that way. He did not need to. His cruelty came in the form of impossible demands, withheld wages, and a constant stream of insults that wore her down more effectively than any physical blow. The saloon doors swung open, letting in a blast of hot afternoon air and the sound of horses nickering outside. Zelda did not look up. She had learned long ago that making eye contact with customers only invited trouble. Either in the form of propositions, she had to delicately refuse, or drunken men who thought a scrubwoman was fair game for their entertainment. She kept her head down, her dark blonde hair falling forward to hide her face, and continued scrubbing at a stubborn stain near the bar. "Water for my horse and whiskey for me," a voice said, deep and measured, with a slight drawl that spoke of Texas or perhaps New Mexico. Zelda heard the bartender, Charlie, respond with his usual efficiency. She dunked her brush back into the bucket, wincing as the lye soap found every crack and cut in her skin. Her hands burned constantly now, a low fire that never quite went out, even in her sleep. "You new in town?" Charlie asked the stranger. "Passing through on my way to San Luis Obispo. Heard there might be ranch work up that way." "Might be. Might be work here too if you are looking. The Hastings spread is always needing hands." Zelda shifted slightly, moving to scrub another section of floor. The Hastings Ranch was the largest in the area, covering thousands of acres of California grassland where they raised cattle and some of the finest horses in the state. She had never been there herself, but she had served enough Hastings Ranch hands to know they were better paid and better treated than most cowboys in the territory. "I will keep that in mind," the stranger said. Zelda felt rather than saw someone approach where she knelt on the floor. She tensed, preparing to move out of the way, but a pair of worn leather boots stopped right beside her bucket. "Madam, you are bleeding into that water," the voice said, and Zelda realized it was the stranger who had just entered. She looked up, shading her eyes against the light from the window behind him, and found herself staring into the most striking face she had ever seen. The man was young, perhaps 25 or 26, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of a summer sky before a storm. His dark brown hair was slightly too long, curling at his collar, and he wore the typical garb of a working cowboy: dusty denim pants, a faded blue shirt, a well-worn hat in his hand, and a gun belt slung low on his hips. But it was his expression that caught her off guard. He was looking at her with something that resembled concern, an emotion she had not seen directed at her in longer than she could remember. "I am fine, thank you," Zelda said quietly, turning back to her work. "It is nothing." "That does not look like nothing." The man crouched down beside her, setting his hat on the floor, and before Zelda could pull away, he had taken one of her hands in his. His touch was gentle, his own hands calloused but warm, and Zelda felt something electric shoot through her at the contact. No one touched her anymore, not kindly, not with care. She started to pull back, but he held on, turning her hand over to examine her palm, then the back where her knuckles were split and bleeding. "Who did this to you?" he asked, his voice dropping low, anger threading through it. "No one did this," Zelda said, finally managing to extract her hand from his grip. "This is my work. I scrub floors." The man's jaw tightened. He looked at her bucket, at the harsh soap and stiff brush, then back at her face. "How long have you been doing this?" "That is none of your concern, sir." "Please, I need to finish before Mr. Stone comes back." "Stone, the owner?" "Yes." The man stood, and Zelda thought that would be the end of it, that he would return to his drink and she could finish her work in peace. But instead, he walked directly to the bar where Charlie was polishing glasses. "I need to speak to Bartholomew Stone," the man said. Charlie raised an eyebrow. "Stone is not here right now. He will be back this evening. Something I can help you with. I want to buy out that woman's contract." Zelda's head snapped up. The brush fell from her numb fingers into the bucket with a splash. "Contract?" Charlie looked confused. "Zelda does not have a contract. She is just a hired girl. Then I want to pay whatever is owed so she can quit." "Friend, I think you might be misunderstanding the situation," Charlie said carefully. "Zelda is free to leave any time she wants. She just has nowhere else to go and no other prospects for work. Stone pays her not much, but it keeps her fed." The stranger turned back to Zelda. "Is that true?" Zelda felt her cheeks burning. The humiliation of having her poverty and desperation laid bare before this handsome stranger was almost more than she could bear. "I do not need your charity," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. "It is not charity," the man said. "It is common decency. Nobody should be working themselves to the bone like this." "Then I suppose the whole town needs your rescue, because I am not the only one working hard for little pay," Zelda shot back. She grabbed her brush and returned to scrubbing with renewed vigor, ignoring the way her hands screamed in protest. The stranger stood there for a long moment, and Zelda could feel his eyes on her, but she refused to look up again. Finally, she heard his boots on the wooden floor as he walked back to the bar, heard the clink of coins, heard the saloon doors swing shut behind him. She told herself she was glad he was gone. She told herself she did not need some cowboy riding in and trying to save her like she was a damsel in a dime novel. She told herself a lot of things as she scrubbed the rest of the floor, but none of them explained why her eyes kept drifting to the door, or why she felt an odd emptiness in her chest. When Bartholomew Stone returned that evening, he was in a foul mood, which meant Zelda made herself as invisible as possible. She had learned to read his tempers, to know when to speak and when to stay silent, when to move quickly and when to move slowly. It was a survival skill she had honed over 3 long years. "The floor looks adequate," Stone said, which was as close to a compliment as he ever gave. "You can start on the windows tomorrow. I want them spotless before the weekend. We will have more customers then." "Yes, sir," Zelda murmured. "And Charlie tells me some cowboy was making a fuss about you this afternoon. I do not need that kind of trouble. You keep your head down and do your work, understand? I will not have you distracting my customers." "I did not do anything," Zelda protested. "He just saw my hands and I do not care what he saw. You work for me and you will conduct yourself appropriately. No encouraging the customers, no sob stories, no making yourself the center of attention." Zelda bit her tongue against the retort that rose up. There was no point arguing with Stone. He always twisted everything to make her the guilty party. "Yes, sir." That night, As Zelda lay in her small room above the general store, she could not stop thinking about the stranger. She did not even know his name. He had touched her hand with such gentleness, had looked at her with such genuine concern, and for just a moment she had felt seen. Not as a scrubwoman, not as the poor Crawford girl whose father drank himself to death, but as a person deserving of kindness. She held her hands up in the darkness, feeling the sting of the cuts, the tightness of the swollen skin. They were ugly hands now, nothing like the soft, nimble hands she had once taken pride in. Her mother had always said Zelda had beautiful hands, perfect for piano or needlework. But her mother had been dead for 10 years, and beautiful hands did not pay for food or shelter. Zelda turned on her side, pulling the thin blanket up to her chin. Tomorrow would be the same as today, and the day after that would be the same as tomorrow. This was her life, and she had accepted it long ago. The stranger was probably already halfway to San Luis Obispo by now, and she would never see him again. But she was wrong. The next morning, as Zelda hauled her bucket of water and rags to start on the saloon windows, she found the stranger sitting on the bench outside, his horse tied to the post nearby. He stood when he saw her, and Zelda felt her heart do an odd little flip in her chest. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," Zelda replied cautiously. She set down her bucket and straightened, wiping her hands on her apron. "I thought you were heading to San Luis Obispo. I changed my mind, took a job at the Hastings Ranch instead." "Oh, that is good. They are supposed to be fair employers." "They seem to be." He took a step closer, and Zelda noticed he was carrying a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I brought you something." "I cannot accept gifts from strangers," Zelda said quickly. "Then let me introduce myself. I am Frank Foster. I am from Amarillo, Texas, originally, though I have been working ranches throughout the West for the past 6 years. I am 25 years old. I do not drink to excess. I do not gamble, and I believe in treating people with respect. Now we are not strangers." Despite herself, Zelda felt a smile tugging at her lips. "That is quite an introduction, Mr. Foster. Frank, please." He held out the package. "And I really wish you would take this. It is salve for your hands. The ranch cook, Mrs. Chen, makes it herself. She says it is the best thing for cuts and raw skin." Zelda hesitated, but the throbbing pain in her hands made the decision for her. She reached out and took the package, her fingers brushing against his. "Thank you. That is very kind. I also wanted to apologize if I overstepped yesterday. I did not mean to embarrass you or imply that you could not take care of yourself. I just—" He trailed off, seeming to search for the right words. "I just could not stand seeing someone hurting like that." "You did not need to apologize," Zelda said softly, "and you did not overstep. I was just surprised, that is all. People do not usually notice me." "Then people are not paying attention," Frank said, and the way he looked at her made Zelda's breath catch. They stood there for a moment, neither quite sure what to say next, until the saloon door banged open and Bartholomew Stone emerged. "Crawford, why are you standing around? Those windows will not clean themselves." Stone's gaze shifted to Frank and his expression hardened. I heard about you." "I do not need you sniffing around my employee and putting ideas in her head." "I am just having a conversation," Frank said evenly, though Zelda saw his hand drift slightly toward his hip, an unconscious gesture that spoke of readiness. "Well, have it somewhere else. Zelda has work to do." Stone grabbed Zelda's elbow, his fingers digging in hard enough to bruise, and steered her toward the door. "Do not touch her like that," Frank said, his voice deadly quiet. Stone stopped. He was not a small man, and he was used to intimidating people through sheer size and bluster. But as he turned to face Frank, something in the younger man's expression made him reconsider whatever he had been about to say. "She is my employee," Stone said instead. I will treat her as I see fit. Not anymore, Frank said. Zelda, I am offering you a job at the Hastings Ranch, Mrs. Hastings needs help with the house, cooking, cleaning, mending. It pays twice what Stone is giving you, plus room and board. No more of this. He gestured to her hands. Zelda felt the world tilt slightly. A job at the Hastings Ranch was more than she had ever dared hope for. But leaving Stone meant burning a bridge, and what if the ranch job did not work out? What if Frank was lying? What if this was all some cruel joke? I cannot, she whispered. Yes, you can, Frank said firmly. You just have to say yes. She is not going anywhere, Stone interrupted. She owes me for the weeks I gave her extra food when she was short on rent. She owes me for the dress I bought her when hers was too worn. She owes me, how much? Frank cut in. Stone blinked. What? How much does she owe you? Name a figure. $50, Stone said, and Zelda gasped because that was an outrageous sum, more than she could make in 6 months at her current wages. Frank pulled out a leather wallet from his pocket and counted out bills. Here is 60. The extra 10 is for being a liar and a cheat who takes advantage of people with no other options. He pressed the money into Stone's hand, then turned to Zelda. Get your things. I will wait. Zelda looked at Frank, then at Stone, then at the money in Stone's hand. She felt like she was in a dream, like none of this could possibly be real. But the package of salve was still clutched in her hand, solid and real, and Frank was looking at her with such steady certainty that she found herself nodding. I will be just a moment, she said, and before Stone could recover enough to protest, she was hurrying around the side of the building toward the stairs to her room. Her possessions fit into a single carpet bag. 2 dresses, one for work and one for church that she rarely attended anymore, undergarments, stockings, her mother's Bible, a photograph of her parents on their wedding day, and a locket that had been her grandmother's. That was the sum total of her life, everything she owned in the world. She changed out of her stained work dress into her better one, a simple blue cotton that had been mended many times but was still presentable. She splashed water on her face from the basin, pinned up her hair as neatly as her sore hands would allow, and took one last look around the room that had been her prison for 3 years. Then she walked down the stairs and out into the bright California sunlight, where Frank Foster was waiting for her. Stone had disappeared back into the saloon, probably to count his money and curse his luck. Charlie stood in the doorway, and when he caught Zelda's eye, he gave her a small nod and a smile. He at least seemed happy for her. Ready? Frank asked. I think so. Zelda looked up at his horse, a tall bay gelding with kind eyes. I am not much of a rider, I should warn you. That is all right. The ranch is not far, just a couple of miles. We can walk if you prefer, or you can ride with me. The thought of sitting so close to Frank, of being held by him for the entire ride, made Zelda's pulse race. But she was also practical, and her feet already hurt from standing on the hard floors. Riding would be faster, she said. Frank mounted first, then extended his hand down to her. Zelda took it, trying not to wince as his grip pressed against her raw palms, and with surprising ease he pulled her up behind him. She settled onto the horse's back, her carpet bag clutched in one hand, her other hand tentatively resting on Frank's waist. Hold on tighter than that, Frank said with a chuckle. I promise I do not bite. Zelda felt her cheeks warm, but she wrapped both arms around his waist, holding her bag against his side. She could feel the solid muscle of his back against her chest, could smell the clean scent of soap and leather, and something that was uniquely him. When the horse started moving, she instinctively pressed closer, and she felt rather than heard Frank's sharp intake of breath. They rode in silence through the town, past the general store and the church and the blacksmith shop, past the small schoolhouse where Zelda had attended classes until she was 14, past the cemetery where her parents were buried side by side. Then they were out on the open road, grassland stretching to the horizon on either side, the Pacific Ocean visible as a blue line to the west. "This is beautiful country," Frank said, breaking the silence. "Different from Texas, but beautiful." "Have you been many places?" Zelda asked. "Quite a few. After my parents died, I did not have anything tying me to one spot, so I just started moving. Worked a ranch in New Mexico for a while, spent some time in Arizona, came up through Nevada into California. I have been looking for a place that feels like home. Have you found it?" Frank was quiet for a moment. "I am starting to think I might have." The Hastings Ranch sprawled across a gentle valley, the main house a large, two-story structure painted white with a wide porch wrapped around the front. There were several barns, a bunkhouse for the ranch hands, a separate cookhouse and various other outbuildings. Cattle dotted the hillsides, and in a large corral near the barn Zelda could see several beautiful horses. Frank rode up to the main house and dismounted, then helped Zelda down. Her legs were unsteady after the ride and she stumbled slightly. Frank caught her elbow, steadying her, his touch gentle and brief. "Let me introduce you to Mrs. Hastings," he said. The front door opened before they reached it, and a woman stepped out onto the porch. She was perhaps 50 years old, with silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a neat bun and sharp, intelligent eyes that took in everything at a glance. She wore a practical dress with an apron over it, and her hands were dusted with flour. "Frank, you are back early from town. And you brought a guest. Mrs. Hastings, this is Miss Zelda Crawford. Zelda, this is Mrs. Margaret Hastings." Zelda dropped into a curtsy, suddenly acutely aware of how shabby she must look compared to this poised, confident woman. "It is an honor to meet you, madam." "Frank tells me you are looking for work," Mrs. Hastings said, coming down the porch steps to get a closer look at Zelda. "He said you have experience with housework." "Yes, madam. I have been working at the Golden Rose Saloon in town for the past 3 years, cleaning and doing whatever else needed to be done. Before that, I kept house for my father until he passed. I can cook, clean, sew, do laundry, tend a garden, and I am a quick learner if there is something I do not know." Mrs. Hastings reached out and took one of Zelda's hands, turning it over to examine it just as Frank had done. But her expression was not one of concern, it was one of quiet anger. "Bartholomew Stone should be horsewhipped," she said flatly. "No one should be working in this condition. Come inside, child. We will get you cleaned up and fed, and then we can discuss the particulars of employment." The interior of the Hastings home was the most beautiful place Zelda had ever seen. The floors were polished wood, covered with woven rugs. The furniture was well made and comfortable looking. There were curtains on the windows, paintings on the walls, and everywhere Zelda looked, there were signs of a home that was lived in and loved. Mrs. Hastings led her to a large kitchen where a Chinese woman was rolling out pie dough. This had to be Mrs. Chen, the cook who had made the salve Frank had given her. "May, this is Zelda Crawford. She will be joining us if I can convince her to stay. Zelda, this is May Chen. She is the finest cook in 3 counties and has been with us for 15 years. May looked up, her dark eyes warm and welcoming. "Please sit. You look like you need a good meal." "I should not impose," Zelda started, but Mrs. Hastings waved a hand dismissively. "Nonsense. Sit." Zelda sat, and within minutes, May had placed a bowl of beef stew in front of her, along with fresh bread, butter, and a glass of cold milk. Zelda could not remember the last time she had eaten a meal that was not whatever scraps she could afford from the general store. She tried to eat slowly to have manners, but she was so hungry that she finished the entire bowl in minutes. "Would you like more?" May asked with a knowing smile. "I could not possibly," Zelda said, though her stomach disagreed. "You can and you will," Mrs. Hastings said firmly. "May, give her another bowl and cut her a slice of that apple pie as well." While Zelda ate her second helping, Mrs. Hastings explained the position. The Hastings had 3 children, but they were all grown now. 2 sons working the ranch with their father and a daughter married and living in San Francisco. The house was large and required a lot of upkeep, more than Mrs. Hastings and May could reasonably manage alone. They needed someone to help with the daily cleaning, the laundry, the mending, and occasionally helping May in the kitchen when they had guests. "The pay is $40 a month, plus room and board," Mrs. Hastings said. "You would have your own room in the house, take your meals with us and the ranch hands in the cookhouse, and have Sunday afternoons off. We expect hard work, but we also expect you to take care of yourself. No one works themselves into the ground on this ranch, understood? $40 a month." Zelda had been making barely 12 at the saloon. It seemed impossible, too good to be true. "Why are you being so kind to me?" Zelda asked, her voice shaking slightly. "You do not even know me, Mrs." Hastings reached across the table and gently squeezed Zelda's forearm, careful to avoid her damaged hands. "Because Frank Foster has good instincts about people, and he came back from town this morning madder than I have ever seen him, saying there was a woman being worked to death by Bartholomew Stone, and would I please give her a job. Because any woman who survives 3 years of Stone's cruelty and still has kindness in her eyes is worth knowing. And because I once was in a position not unlike yours before Mr. Hastings gave me a chance. We all need someone to believe in us, Zelda. I am choosing to believe in you." Tears spilled down Zelda's cheeks before she could stop them. She wiped at them with the back of her hand, embarrassed, but Mrs. Hastings just handed her a clean handkerchief. "I will work harder than anyone you have ever employed," Zelda promised. "I will not let you down. I know you will not. Now, let us get you settled in your room, and then May will put some of her salve on those hands. You are not to do any work until they have healed. Do you understand? I will not have you causing permanent damage." Zelda's room was on the 2nd floor of the house, small but clean, with a real bed, a wardrobe, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the valley. After 3 years of her cramped room above the general store, it felt like a palace. May came up with a basin of warm water and the tin of salve. She gently washed Zelda's hands, then applied the ointment with careful precision. The salve was cool and soothing, and Zelda felt immediate relief as the burning sensation faded. "Keep this with you," May said, handing Zelda the tin. "Apply it every morning and evening and whenever your hands feel sore. They will heal quickly if you give them a chance to rest." "Thank you," Zelda said. "Thank you for everything," May smiled. "Frank is a good man. When he asks for something, Mrs. Hastings listens. He has only been here a week, but already everyone can see he is special." After May left, Zelda sat on the edge of the bed, looking around her new room. She unpacked her carpet bag, hanging her dresses in the wardrobe, placing her mother's Bible on the small table beside the bed, setting the photograph of her parents on top of the dresser. The locket she fastened around her neck, feeling the familiar weight of it against her breastbone. Then she lay back on the bed, which was softer than anything she had slept on in years, and closed her eyes. She was not sure how her life had changed so dramatically in the span of a single day, but she sent up a silent prayer of gratitude. And in that prayer, she included Frank Foster, the stranger who had seen her pain and refused to look away. The next few days passed in a haze of rest and healing. True to her word, Mrs. Hastings refused to let Zelda do any real work, though Zelda chafed at the inactivity. She was used to working from dawn to dark, and sitting idle made her anxious. But her hands were healing, the cuts closing, the swelling going down, the angry red color fading to pink. She saw Frank occasionally, usually at meals in the cookhouse. The ranch hands ate together, a rowdy, cheerful group of men ranging in age from 16 to 60. Frank always saved her a seat beside him, and they would talk quietly while the other men joked and told stories. Zelda learned that Frank was an excellent horseman, that he had a gift for gentling wild horses, that the other ranch hands respected him despite his short time on the ranch. "You seem to have found your place here quickly," Zelda observed one evening as they walked from the cookhouse back toward the main house. "It is a good outfit," Frank agreed. "Mr. Hastings is fair, the work is honest, and the people are decent. I could see myself staying here for a long while." They had reached the porch steps, and Zelda paused. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold, and the evening air was cool and sweet with the scent of grass and wildflowers. "I never properly thanked you," Zelda said, turning to face Frank, "for what you did. Getting me away from Stone, bringing me here. You did not have to do any of that." "Yes, I did," Frank said simply. "Zelda, from the moment I saw you on that saloon floor, your hands bleeding, working yourself to nothing, I knew I could not just walk away. I have seen a lot of hard things in my life, a lot of cruelty and injustice, and I have not always been able to do anything about it. But this time I could. This time I was in the right place at the right time to help, and I am grateful I was." "Is that all it was?" Zelda asked, surprising herself with her boldness. Being in the right place at the right time, Frank took a step closer. In the fading light, his eyes looked more gray than blue, and they were fixed on her face with an intensity that made her heart race. "No," he said quietly. "That is not all it was." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, and took one of her hands in his. He lifted it gently, examining the healing skin, then did something that took Zelda's breath away. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her palm, then her knuckles, then the back of her hand. "These hands were raw from scrubbing floors," Frank said, his voice rough with emotion. "And I am telling you, Zelda Crawford, no more serving. No more working yourself to the bone for men who do not appreciate you. No more settling for scraps when you deserve a feast. You understand me?" Zelda could not speak. She could barely breathe. No one had ever spoken to her like this, with such fierce protectiveness and tenderness combined. No one had ever kissed her hands like they were something precious. "I understand," she whispered. Frank smiled, and it transformed his whole face, making him look younger and almost boyish. "Good, because I have plans, Zelda. Plans that include this ranch and building something and making a life worth living. And I would very much like for those plans to include you if you are willing. We have known each other less than a week," Zelda pointed out, though her heart was singing. "I know. And I am not asking you to marry me tomorrow. I am just asking if I can court you properly. Take walks with you, sit with you at meals, get to know you better. See if what I am feeling is real, if what you might be feeling is real." "I would like that very much," Zelda said, and she was rewarded with another one of those brilliant smiles. Frank kissed her hand once more, then released it. "Good night, Zelda. Sleep well." "Good night, Frank." Zelda floated up to her room, her hand still tingling from his kisses. She sat by her window, looking out at the darkening landscape, and for the first time in years, she let herself hope. Hope for a future that was more than just survival. Hope for happiness, for love, for a life shared with someone who saw her as more than just a scrubwoman. The next morning, May declared Zelda's hands healed enough for light work. So Zelda threw herself into her new job with enthusiasm. She cleaned the already clean house until it gleamed, organized the linen closet, mended a pile of shirts and trousers, helped May prepare meals, and still had energy left over. Mrs. Hastings watched with amusement as Zelda tackled task after task. "You do not need to prove yourself, dear," she said gently. "We already know you are a hard worker." "I just want to earn my keep," Zelda replied, pausing in her polishing of the dining room table. "You have earned it 10 times over already, but I appreciate your diligence. Just do not overdo it. Your hands are still healing." Zelda looked down at her hands, which bore only faint pink scars now where the worst cuts had been. The salve had worked miracles, and the rest had done even more. They would never be the soft, unblemished hands of her youth, but they were functional and pain-free, and that was more than enough. In the afternoon, Frank appeared at the kitchen door, his hat in his hand. "Mrs. Hastings, would it be all right if I borrowed Zelda for a bit? I want to show her the horses." Mrs. Hastings glanced at Zelda, her expression knowing. "I think that would be fine. Zelda has been working hard all morning. She deserves a break." Frank led Zelda to the large corral where several horses grazed and dozed in the sun. One, a gray mare with a white blaze, lifted her head and whinnied when she saw Frank approach. "This is Silver," Frank said, climbing over the fence and gesturing for Zelda to follow. "She is the gentlest horse on the ranch. I thought you might like to meet her properly." Zelda climbed carefully over the fence, her skirts making the process awkward, and Frank steadied her with a hand on her waist. Once she was safely on the other side, he led her to Silver, who regarded Zelda with large, liquid eyes. "Hold out your hand flat like this," Frank demonstrated. "Let her smell you." Zelda extended her hand, palm flat, and Silver lowered her head to sniff delicately at Zelda's fingers. Then the mare bumped her nose against Zelda's hand, clearly asking for attention, and Zelda laughed, delighted. "She likes you," Frank said, coming to stand beside Zelda. He placed his hand over hers, guiding her to stroke Silver's neck. "See, just long, gentle strokes. Horses can tell when someone is nervous, so stay calm and confident." Zelda was not sure if she was calm or confident with Frank standing so close, his hand warm over hers, his shoulder brushing against her as they petted the horse together. But Silver did not seem to mind, leaning into the attention with obvious pleasure. "I have been thinking," Frank said after a while, "about what I said last night about courting you." "Oh," Zelda tried to keep her voice steady. "There is a church social next weekend in town. Music, dancing, food. Would you come with me?" "I would love to," Zelda said. And she meant it, though the thought of going back to town, of possibly seeing Stone or others who had known her in her previous circumstances, made her nervous. Frank must have sensed her hesitation because he turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "You have nothing to be ashamed of, Zelda. Nothing. You survived a hard situation with your dignity and your kindness intact. Anyone who looks down on you for that is not worth your concern." "I know that in my head," Zelda admitted, "but my heart is still catching up." "Then I will just have to help your heart catch up," Frank said, and he leaned down and kissed her forehead, gentle and sweet. Zelda closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence. She had known this man for less than 2 weeks, but already she could not imagine her life without him. It should have been terrifying, this intensity of feeling, but instead, it felt right, like coming home after a long journey. The church social was held in the town square, with tables of food set up under colorful bunting, a small platform for the musicians, and lanterns strung from the trees to provide light as evening fell. Zelda wore her Sunday dress, which Mrs. Hastings had helped her alter to fit better, and May had lent her a beautiful shawl embroidered with flowers. Frank wore his best clothes, dark trousers, a white shirt, a brocade vest, and a string tie, and when he came to collect her from the main house, Zelda thought he was the handsomest man she had ever seen. They rode into town in one of the ranch wagons, along with Mrs. Hastings, May, and several of the ranch hands. Mr. Hastings and his sons were already in town, having gone early to help set up. The atmosphere was festive, and Zelda felt her nervousness begin to fade as they joined the growing crowd. The musicians struck up a lively tune and couples began to dance. Frank offered Zelda his hand with a small bow. "May I have this dance, Miss Crawford? I am not much of a dancer," Zelda warned. "That is all right. Neither am I. We can muddle through together." They joined the other dancers, and true to his word, Frank was not particularly skilled. But he was enthusiastic and patient, guiding Zelda through the steps, laughing when they stumbled, pulling her closer when the music slowed. By the third dance, they had found their rhythm, moving together as if they had been dancing for years rather than minutes. "You are a quick learner," Frank said as they spun. "I have a good teacher," Zelda replied, breathless and happy. Between dances, they sampled the food, talked with the other ranch hands and townspeople, and enjoyed the mild evening. Zelda saw several people she recognized from her time working at the saloon, and while some gave her curious looks, no one said anything unkind. Mrs. Hastings made a point of introducing Zelda as her household assistant, giving Zelda a stamp of respectability that seemed to smooth over any potential awkwardness. Then Zelda saw Bartholomew Stone across the square, standing with a group of men near the punch bowl. He noticed her at the same moment and his expression darkened. He started walking toward her, and Zelda felt her stomach drop. "Zelda, there you are," Stone said loudly, drawing attention from those around them. "I have been meaning to have a word with you." Frank materialized at Zelda's side, his posture casual but his eyes hard. "Is there a problem, Stone?" "No problem. I just wanted to tell Zelda that her former room has been rented to someone else. So if this ranch job does not work out, she should not expect to come crawling back." "She will not be coming back," Frank said evenly. "And I think you should move along now." Stone opened his mouth, probably to say something else nasty, but Mr. Hastings appeared, flanked by his two sons. Both sons were large, broad-shouldered men who clearly worked hard for a living, and they stood with their arms crossed, looking at Stone with flat, unfriendly expressions. "Is there a problem here, Stone?" Mr. Hastings asked, his voice mild but his meaning clear. Stone looked at Frank, then at the Hastings men, then back at Zelda. Whatever he saw in their faces made him reconsider his approach. "No problem," he muttered. "I was just leaving." He stalked away, and Zelda let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. Frank put his arm around her shoulders, a protective gesture that made her feel safe and cherished. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. "I am fine, thank you." "He will not bother you again," Mr. Hastings said firmly. "I will make sure of it." The rest of the evening passed without incident, and by the time they loaded back into the wagon for the ride home, Zelda was exhausted but happier than she had been in years. She sat close to Frank on the bench, his arm around her to keep her steady, and looked up at the stars scattered across the vast California sky. "Thank you for tonight," she said softly. "Thank you for coming with me," Frank replied. "I know it was hard going back to town." "It was. But it was also good. I feel like I am reclaiming my life, piece by piece, and you are helping me do that." Frank tightened his arm around her. "I will always help you, Zelda, always." As summer turned to fall, Zelda and Frank's courtship deepened. They spent every spare moment together, walking through the hills around the ranch, sitting on the porch in the evenings talking about their pasts and their dreams for the future. working side by side when their duties allowed. Frank taught Zelda to ride, patient and encouraging as she learned to trust the horse beneath her. Zelda taught Frank to dance better, practicing in the barn when no one was watching, laughing as they twirled across the hay-strewn floor. The entire ranch seemed to be rooting for them. The ranch hands teased Frank good-naturedly about being smitten, and Mrs. Hastings watched with obvious approval as the relationship grew. Even Mr. Hastings, a man of few words, told Frank one evening that Zelda was welcome at the ranch for as long as she wanted to stay, which everyone understood as his blessing on the courtship. One October afternoon, Frank appeared at the main house looking nervous. He asked Zelda if she would take a walk with him, and there was something in his voice that made her heart skip. They walked to a spot on a hill overlooking the ranch, where the grass was golden and the oak trees were just beginning to turn. Frank spread out a blanket he had brought and they sat looking out at the view. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "Zelda," Frank finally said, "I have been thinking about the future a lot lately." "So have I," Zelda admitted. "Mr. Hastings has offered to sell me a parcel of land, about 200 acres on the eastern edge of the ranch. Says he is getting too old to work all his holdings properly, and he would rather sell to someone he trusts. The price is more than fair, and I have been saving my wages. I could make a down payment by spring." Zelda's breath caught. "Frank, that is wonderful. It would be hard work building a spread from nothing. I would need to build a house, establish a herd, put up fences. It would be years before it would be truly profitable. You could do it." "I know you could." Frank turned to face her, taking her hands in his. They were sitting close enough that Zelda could see the flecks of darker blue in his eyes, could count the faint freckles across his nose. "I do not want to do it alone," Frank said. "Zelda, I love you. I have loved you since the day I saw you on that saloon floor, and every day since has only made me more certain. I want to build a life with you, a home with you, a future with you. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep holding you every night. I want to raise children with you and grow old with you. I want everything, Zelda, and I want it all with you." Tears were streaming down Zelda's face, but she was smiling so wide it almost hurt. "I love you too, Frank. I love you so much. Then will you marry me?" Frank reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring, simple gold with a small diamond. "I know it is not much, but it is perfect," Zelda interrupted, launching herself into his arms. "Yes, I will marry you. Yes, yes, yes." They fell back onto the blanket, laughing and crying at the same time. And then Frank was kissing her, really kissing her, and Zelda felt like her heart might burst from happiness. His lips were warm and gentle, then more insistent as she kissed him back, her fingers threading through his hair, her body pressed against his. They lost themselves in each other, in the joy of finally admitting what they had both known for months, that they were meant to be together. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Frank slipped the ring onto Zelda's finger. It fit perfectly. "I was so afraid you would say no," Frank admitted. "How could I possibly say no to you?" Zelda asked. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Frank Foster. You saw me when I was invisible, you valued me when I felt worthless, and you loved me when I did not think I was worth loving. You gave me back my life. You gave me a reason to stop wandering," Frank said. "You gave me a home." They stayed on that hillside until the sun began to set, making plans and dreaming dreams. They decided to marry in the spring, giving Frank time to make the down payment on the land and start building a house. Zelda would continue working at the main house until the wedding, saving every penny she could to help with expenses. Mrs. Hastings would make her wedding dress, and the ceremony would be at the small church in town, followed by a celebration at the ranch. When they returned to the ranch house, hand in hand, Everyone seemed to know immediately what had happened. Mrs. Hastings took one look at Zelda's glowing face and the ring on her finger and pulled her into a tight hug. "Congratulations, dear. I am so happy for you both." The ranch hands clapped Frank on the back and offered congratulations mixed with ribald jokes about married life. May produced a bottle of wine she had been saving for a special occasion, and Mr. Hastings proposed a toast. "To Frank and Zelda," he said, raising his glass. "May your marriage be long, your love be strong, and your ranch be prosperous." "To Frank and Zelda," everyone chorused. That night, Zelda lay in her bed, looking at the ring on her finger, still hardly able to believe it was real. She was going to marry Frank Foster. She was going to be a wife, maybe someday a mother. She was going to have her own home, her own land, her own life built on something more than just survival. She thought about the girl she had been just 6 months ago, scrubbing floors in that saloon, her hands raw and bleeding, her spirit nearly broken. That girl would not have believed this was possible. But that girl had also been stronger than she knew, strong enough to survive, strong enough to accept help when it was offered, strong enough to open her heart to love even after so much hardship. Winter came to Paso Robles, not harsh like winters in other parts of the country, but bringing cooler temperatures and blessed rain. Frank spent every spare moment working on the house, helped by the other ranch hands on their days off. Zelda watched the structure take shape, first just a frame, then walls, then a roof. It was not large, just 4 rooms and a porch, but it was solid and well built, and it was theirs. Zelda sewed when she could, making curtains for the windows, quilts for the bed, dish towels, and tablecloths. Mrs. Hastings gave her a set of dishes that had belonged to her mother, and May contributed pots and pans. The ranch hands built them a table and chairs, and Mr. Hastings gifted them a breeding pair of pigs and a dozen chickens to start their own livestock. "You have been good to this ranch," Mr. Hastings told Frank. "It is only right that we help you get started." Frank was overwhelmed by the generosity, and Zelda saw him wipe at his eyes more than once. They were building more than just a house and a ranch. They were building a community, a family of choice rather than blood. As spring approached, wedding preparations intensified. The dress Mrs. Hastings was making was beautiful, white with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs, fitted at the waist and with a full skirt. When Zelda tried it on for the final fitting, she barely recognized herself in the mirror. She looked happy, healthy, and hopeful, nothing like the gaunt, exhausted woman Frank had first met. "You are a beautiful bride," Mrs. Hastings said, adjusting the hem. "I feel beautiful," Zelda replied. "For the first time in my life, I actually feel beautiful." The wedding was scheduled for the 3rd Saturday in April, when the wildflowers would be blooming across the hills and the weather would be mild. But a week before the wedding, a rider came to the ranch with news that made Zelda's blood run cold. Bartholomew Stone was telling anyone who would listen that Zelda had stolen money from him before she left, and he was planning to bring charges against her. It was a lie, a complete fabrication, but Stone had always been a convincing liar, and he had friends in town who might believe him. "He cannot do this," Zelda said, her voice shaking. "I did not take anything. Frank paid him more than I ever owed." "We know that," Mrs. Hastings said firmly, "and we will make sure everyone else knows it too." Frank was angrier than Zelda had ever seen him. He wanted to ride into town immediately and confront Stone, but Mr. Hastings and his sons convinced him that would only make things worse. Instead, they decided to approach the sheriff, a fair-minded man named Tom Beckman who had no love for Bartholomew Stone. The next morning, Frank, Mr. Hastings, and Zelda rode into town together. Sheriff Beckman listened to their story, examined the receipt Frank had kept from his payment to Stone, and talked to Charlie from the saloon, who confirmed that Frank had paid Stone in full and then some. "Stone is just stirring up trouble because he is angry," the sheriff concluded. "There are no grounds for charges, and I will tell him as much. I am sorry you had to deal with this, Miss Crawford." "Thank you, Sheriff," Zelda said, relief flooding through her, but Stone was not done. That evening, as Zelda was helping May prepare dinner in the cookhouse, a rock came flying through the window, shattering glass across the floor. Wrapped around the rock was a note that read, "Thieves do not deserve happiness." Frank found Zelda sitting on the floor, the note clutched in her hand, tears streaming down her face. He gathered her into his arms, holding her as she cried. "I am not going to let him ruin this for us," Frank said fiercely. "I am not going to let him hurt you anymore. What can we do?" Zelda asked. "He will just keep causing problems." "Leave that to me," Frank said, and there was something in his tone that both worried and reassured Zelda. The next day, Frank rode into town alone. He found Bartholomew Stone at the saloon and asked him to step outside. A crowd gathered, sensing confrontation, but Frank kept his voice calm and measured. "You have two choices, Stone," Frank said. "You can stop harassing Zelda, stop spreading lies, and leave us alone to live our lives. Or I can make sure everyone in this town knows exactly what kind of man you are. I can tell them how you exploited a woman with no other options, how you paid her starvation wages while working her to the bone, how you lied about debts to keep her trapped. I can make sure no decent person will do business with you ever again." Stone laughed, but it sounded forced. "You think anyone will believe you over me? I am a respected businessman in this town. Are you?" Frank looked around at the gathered crowd. "Because from what I have heard, a lot of people know exactly what you are. They just have not had anyone willing to stand up to you before." "Well, I am standing up to you now. Leave Zelda alone, or I will make it my personal mission to ruin you the way you tried to ruin her." For a long moment, Stone and Frank stared at each other. Then Stone looked away first, and Frank knew he had won. "Fine," Stone muttered. "I have better things to do than worry about some nobody scrubwoman anyway." "She is not a scrubwoman," Frank said quietly. "She is the woman I am going to marry, and she is worth 10 of you." He turned and walked away, leaving Stone standing there, and the crowd slowly dispersed. Frank knew the story would be all over town by evening, and he also knew that public opinion would side with Zelda. Stone's power had always come from people's fear of him, and Frank had just shown that he was not afraid. When Frank returned to the ranch and told Zelda what had happened, she threw her arms around his neck. "You did not have to do that for me," she said. "Yes, I did. You are going to be my wife. Protecting you is not just something I want to do, it is something I need to do." "I love you so much, Frank Foster." "I love you too, Zelda Crawford, soon to be Zelda Foster." The wedding day dawned clear and beautiful, the sky a brilliant blue, the air sweet with the scent of wildflowers. Zelda woke early, too excited to sleep, and spent the morning getting ready with Mrs. Hastings and May's help. They styled her hair, pinned a small wreath of flowers to her head, and helped her into the beautiful white dress. When Zelda looked at herself in the mirror, she saw a woman transformed. Not just in appearance, though she looked lovely, but in spirit. She saw a woman who had survived hardship and come out stronger. A woman who had been given a second chance and had seized it with both hands. A woman who was loved and who loved in return. The ceremony was held at the small church in town, packed with well-wishers from the ranch and the surrounding community. Frank stood at the altar looking nervous and handsome in his best suit, and when Zelda walked down the aisle on Mr. Hastings' arm, she saw his eyes fill with tears. The minister, an elderly man named Reverend Matthews, performed the ceremony with warmth and humor. When it came time for the vows, Frank took Zelda's hands in his, careful as always of her once damaged palms, and spoke from his heart. "Zelda, I promise to love you, honor you, and cherish you for all the days of my life. I promise to work beside you, to support your dreams, and to build a life with you that is full of joy and laughter. I promise that you will never again have to work yourself to exhaustion, that you will never again feel alone or unvalued. I promise to be the man you deserve, the partner you need, and the husband you can always count on." Zelda was crying openly now, happy tears that she did not bother to hide. She squeezed Frank's hands and spoke her own vows. "Frank, I promise to love you with all my heart, to stand by your side through whatever challenges come, and to make our house a home filled with warmth and love. I promise to work beside you, to share your burdens, and to celebrate your triumphs. I promise to be the wife you deserve, the partner you need, and the friend you can always count on. You gave me my life back, and I am giving that life to you, freely and joyfully." When Reverend Matthews pronounced them husband and wife, Frank kissed Zelda with such tenderness and passion that the congregation broke into spontaneous applause and cheers. They walked back down the aisle together, hand in hand, grinning at their friends and family, and emerged into the bright California sunshine as Mr. and Mrs. Frank Foster. The celebration at the ranch was everything Zelda could have hoped for and more. There was food and music and dancing, and everyone from miles around seemed to have come to wish them well. Even Sheriff Beckman made an appearance, bringing a hand-carved wooden box as a wedding gift. Notably absent was Bartholomew Stone, and no one missed him. As the sun began to set, Frank and Zelda slipped away from the party and walked to their new home, their first home together. Frank carried Zelda over the threshold, both of them laughing, and set her down gently in the middle of their small parlor. "Welcome home, Mrs. Foster," he said. "It is perfect," Zelda said, looking around at the simple furniture, the curtains she had sewn, the dishes on the shelves. "It is absolutely perfect." That night, as they lay together in their bed, Frank traced the faint scars on Zelda's palms with his fingertips. "You remember that first day?" he asked. "When I found you scrubbing that saloon floor, I remember," Zelda said. "I thought you were crazy, this stranger trying to rescue me. And now I know you are my miracle, my answered prayer, my everything." Frank pulled her close, and they held each other in the darkness. Two people who had found each other against all odds, who had built something beautiful out of hardship and hope. Their first year of marriage was filled with hard work and simple joys. They planted crops, tended their small herd of cattle that they had started with money saved and a loan from Mr. Hastings, raised chickens and pigs, and slowly built their ranch into something profitable. Zelda discovered she had a talent for raising chickens, and her eggs became sought after in town for their rich golden yolks. Frank gentled wild horses and sold them to nearby ranches, building a reputation as a skilled horseman. They worked from dawn to dusk most days, but it was different from the endless, soul-crushing labor Zelda had known at the saloon. This work had purpose and meaning. They were building something together, creating a life and a legacy. And at the end of each day, they had each other. In the evenings, they would sit on their porch and watch the sun set over the hills. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they simply sat in comfortable silence, and sometimes Frank would play a harmonica he had bought in town while Zelda sang softly. These were the moments Zelda treasured most, the quiet times when she could simply be present with the man she loved. A year and a half after their wedding, Zelda realized she was pregnant. She told Frank one evening after dinner, watching his face carefully to gauge his reaction. For a moment he just stared at her, and then a grin spread across his face so wide and genuine that Zelda started laughing. "A baby," he said. "We are having a baby." "We are having a baby," Zelda confirmed, and then Frank was lifting her up and spinning her around, both of them laughing and crying at the same time. The pregnancy was not easy. Zelda was sick for the first few months, unable to keep much food down, and Frank worried constantly. But May came to visit often, bringing herbal teas and remedies that helped, and Mrs. Hastings was a constant source of advice and reassurance. By the time Zelda entered her 6th month, she was feeling better, her body adjusting to the changes, her belly growing round and firm. Frank was endlessly fascinated by the pregnancy, talking to Zelda's belly, feeling for the baby's kicks, making plans for how they would expand the house to accommodate their growing family. He built a cradle from oak wood, sanding it until it was smooth as silk, and Zelda sewed tiny clothes and blankets, marveling at how small they seemed. One evening in late autumn, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Frank took Zelda's hand. "Do you ever think about where you would be if we had not met?" he asked. Zelda was quiet for a moment, considering. "I try not to," she admitted. "But sometimes I do, and it terrifies me, Frank. I was dying in that saloon, slowly but surely. My body was wearing out, my spirit was breaking, and I had no hope of anything better. If you had not walked through those doors that day, I do not know what would have become of me." "You would have survived," Frank said firmly. "You are the strongest person I know, Zelda. You would have found a way, maybe. But I am grateful I did not have to find out. I am grateful for you, for this life, for everything we have built together. I am grateful too. You know, when I was wandering from ranch to ranch, I was searching for something, though I did not know what. I thought it was a place, a piece of land I could call my own. But it was not a place I needed. It was a person. It was you." The baby was born in February of 1880 during a rare cold snap that brought frost to the California grass. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next afternoon. May and Mrs. Hastings stayed with Zelda the entire time, coaching her through the contractions, while Frank paced the porch outside, wearing a path in the wooden boards. Finally, just as the sun was beginning to set, Zelda gave one final push and the baby entered the world, screaming lustily. May wrapped the infant in a clean blanket and placed the baby in Zelda's arms. "You have a son," she said, smiling. Zelda looked down at the tiny, red-faced creature in her arms, overwhelmed with love so fierce it took her breath away. The baby had a shock of dark hair and Frank's nose, and when he opened his eyes briefly, they were a cloudy blue that might turn brown or might stay blue as he grew. "Frank," Zelda called, her voice hoarse from hours of labor, "come meet your son." Frank burst through the door, nearly tripping in his haste, and knelt beside the bed. He looked at the baby, then at Zelda, then back at the baby, and tears streamed down his face. "He is perfect," Frank whispered. "He is absolutely perfect." "You want to hold him?" Frank nodded, and Zelda carefully transferred their son to Frank's arms. The baby looked impossibly small against Frank's broad chest, but Frank held him with surprising confidence, supporting the tiny head, murmuring soft words. "Hello, little one. I am your father. I have been waiting to meet you." They named him William Francis Foster, William for Frank's father and Francis as a nod to Frank's own name. They called him Will for short, and from the very beginning he was the light of their lives. Those early months were exhausting, filled with sleepless nights and endless feedings, but they were also magical. Zelda had never known love like this existed, love for this tiny person who depended on them for everything. She and Frank took turns walking Will when he was fussy, singing to him, marveling at his tiny fingers and toes. The ranch hands visited often, bringing gifts and awkwardly trying to interact with the baby. One of the older hands, a man named Pete who was as tough as old leather, completely melted when Will grabbed his finger with a tiny fist. And from that day forward he was a constant visitor, always wanting to hold the baby. Mrs. Hastings and May were frequent guests as well, helping Zelda with the endless laundry that a baby generated, bringing food so Zelda did not have to cook, offering advice and reassurance when Zelda worried that she was not doing things right. "You are a wonderful mother, Mrs. Hastings told Zelda one afternoon as they folded tiny clothes together. "Will is lucky to have you." "I am the lucky one," Zelda said. "All of this, the ranch, Frank, Will, it is more than I ever dreamed possible." As Will grew from an infant into a chubby, happy baby who smiled at everyone and laughed at his father's silly faces, Zelda found herself thinking often about the journey that had brought her to this point. She thought about the girl scrubbing floors with bleeding hands, about the moment Frank had walked into that saloon, about the choice she had made to trust him and accept his help. It had not been easy. There had been hard times, moments of doubt, challenges to overcome. But through it all, she and Frank had faced everything together, and that had made all the difference. One evening in early summer, when Will was almost 6 months old, Zelda stood on the porch watching Frank play with their son in the grass. Frank was lying on his back, holding Will up in the air above him, and the baby was shrieking with delight. The setting sun turned everything golden, and Zelda felt her heart swell with happiness. Frank noticed her watching and smiled. "Come join us," he called. Zelda walked down the steps and settled onto the grass beside her husband and son. Will immediately reached for her, babbling happily, and she took him into her arms, pressing kisses to his soft cheeks. "I have been thinking," Frank said, propping himself up on one elbow, "about expanding the house, adding on a couple more bedrooms." "Already," Zelda laughed. "Will does not even sleep through the night yet." "I know, but I want more children, Zelda. I want to fill this house with love and laughter. I want Will to have siblings to grow up with the way I did not." Zelda looked at Frank, at the hope and love shining in his eyes, and felt tears prick her own eyes. "I want that too," she said softly. Frank reached over and took her hand, the one that bore the faint scars of her old life. He brought it to his lips and kissed it, just as he had that first time. "These hands were raw from scrubbing floors," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I told you, no more serving. You are my wife, my partner, the mother of my children. You are cherished and valued and loved beyond measure. And I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never forget that." "I love you, Frank Foster," Zelda said. "With everything I am, I love you." "I love you too, Zelda Foster. Always." They sat there as the sun set, their son between them, and watched as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Zelda thought about all the nights she had looked up at these same stars from her tiny room above the general store, wondering if her life would ever be more than just endless work and weariness. And now here she was, sitting in the grass of her own land beside her husband, holding their child, living a life she had not dared to dream was possible. The years passed in a blur of joy and hard work. True to Frank's wish, they expanded their family. 2 years after Will, they welcomed a daughter they named Rose Margaret, after the wildflowers that grew on their land and Mrs. Hastings who had been so kind to them. Rose had Zelda's blonde hair and Frank's blue eyes, and she was a sweet, gentle child who loved animals and could often be found in the barn talking to the horses. 3 years after Rose came another son, James, who was the opposite of his placid older brother. James was into everything from the moment he could crawl, and Zelda and Frank spent years chasing after him, pulling him out of trouble and marveling at his fearless spirit. The ranch prospered as the children grew. Frank's reputation as a horseman spread, and they began breeding their own horses, beautiful, strong animals that sold for good prices. Zelda's chickens multiplied, and she started selling not just eggs but young birds to other farms. They added sheep to their livestock, and Zelda learned to spin and weave, making cloth they could sell in town. The house expanded multiple times, growing from 4 rooms to 8, then to 10. They added a proper dining room where they could host dinners for friends and neighbors, a bigger kitchen with a new stove that Zelda loved, and bedrooms for each of the children. The cradle Frank had built for Will was used for all 3 children, and then was carefully stored away, waiting for grandchildren. Through it all, Zelda never forgot where she had come from. She and Frank made a point of helping others in difficult circumstances, quietly paying medical bills for families who could not afford them, giving work to men down on their luck, and supporting the church's charity efforts. When a young woman came to town with a story similar to Zelda's, fleeing an abusive situation with nowhere to go, Zelda hired her immediately to help with the house and children, giving her the same chance she had been given, Mr. and Mrs. Hastings remained close friends, though they aged and eventually turned the management of their ranch over to their sons. Mrs. Hastings lived long enough to meet all 3 of Zelda's children and to tell Zelda how proud she was of the woman she had become. When Mrs. Hastings passed in her sleep at the age of 72, Zelda mourned her like she would have mourned her own mother. Bartholomew Stone, by contrast, faded into obscurity. His business failed, partly due to his own mismanagement and partly due to his damaged reputation. He eventually left Paso Robles, and no one knew or cared where he went. His story served as a cautionary tale, proof that cruelty and exploitation eventually came back to haunt those who practiced them. One warm summer evening when Will was 15, Rose was 13, and James was 10, the family gathered on the porch after dinner. The children were playing a game in the yard, their laughter ringing out in the twilight, and Frank and Zelda sat in their rocking chairs, holding hands as they had done countless times before. "You remember that first day?" Frank asked, a question he had asked many times over the years. "I remember," Zelda said, as she always did. "I remember thinking you were the most handsome man I had ever seen and the craziest, trying to rescue someone you did not even know. Best crazy decision I ever made," Frank said with a grin. "You have any regrets?" Zelda asked. "About how our life turned out?" Frank turned to look at her, his eyes serious. "Not a single one. Every day with you has been a gift, Zelda, every single day. Even the hard days, especially the hard days because we faced them together." Will called out from the yard, asking his father to come settle a dispute about the rules of their game, and Frank stood with a laugh. "Duty calls," he said, bending to kiss Zelda's forehead. "I will be right back." Zelda watched her husband jog down the porch steps to join their children, watched him scoop up young James and tickle him until he squealed, watched Rose throw her arms around her father's waist in a hug. This was her life now, these moments of pure, simple joy. This was what Frank's intervention had given her, not just a rescue from a bad situation, but a whole new life full of love and possibility. She looked down at her hands, resting in her lap. They were calloused now from work, but it was good work, meaningful work. The scars from her time at the saloon had faded over the years, barely visible anymore. But Zelda never forgot they were there. They were a reminder of where she had come from, of what she had survived, of how far she had come. As the stars came out and the children finally wound down, ready for bed, Zelda herded them inside for washing and prayers. She tucked each one in, listening to their chatter about the day, answering their questions and giving them kisses goodnight. Then she and Frank retired to their own room, the room where they had shared so many nights, so many conversations, so many moments of intimacy and connection. As they lay in bed, Frank's arms around her, Zelda felt profoundly grateful. Not just for the material things, the house and the land and the security, though those were certainly blessings, but more for the intangible things, for being seen and valued, for being loved unconditionally, for having a partner who had kept his promise that she would never have to serve like that again, who had worked beside her to build a life of dignity and purpose. "Thank you," she whispered into the darkness. "For what?" Frank asked, his voice sleepy. "For everything. For seeing me when I was invisible, for loving me when I did not love myself, for giving me this beautiful life." Frank tightened his arms around her. "You gave me just as much, Zelda. You gave me a home, a family, a purpose. You gave me everything that matters." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, two people who had found each other against all odds and had built something beautiful and lasting. The years continued to pass, bringing more joys and occasional sorrows. The children grew up, each finding their own paths. Will took over much of the ranch management, showing a natural talent for business and animal husbandry. He eventually married a kind schoolteacher named Sarah, and they gave Zelda and Frank their first grandchildren, twin boys who were as rambunctious as their Uncle James had been. Rose, true to her gentle nature, became a nurse, working at the new hospital in San Luis Obispo. She married a doctor, and they had 3 daughters who all inherited their mother's love of caring for others. James, after worrying his parents gray with his wild ways, finally settled down when he fell in love with a fiery redhead named Catherine, who ran a mercantile in town. They had 4 children, and eventually took over Zelda's chicken and weaving business, expanding it into a thriving enterprise. Frank and Zelda aged together, their love deepening with each passing year. Frank's dark hair turned gray, then white, but his blue eyes remained as bright and sharp as ever. Zelda's face gained lines, evidence of years spent smiling and laughing, and her hands showed the marks of hard work, but she remained beautiful to Frank, just as he remained handsome to her. On their 30th wedding anniversary, their children and grandchildren threw them a huge celebration. The house and yard were filled with people, friends and neighbors and family, all wanting to honor the couple who had built such a remarkable life together. There were speeches and toasts, food and music and dancing, and through it all, Frank and Zelda sat together, their hands intertwined, watching the celebration with happy tears in their eyes. When the party finally wound down and the last guests had left, Frank and Zelda walked slowly to their favorite spot on the hill overlooking the ranch. It was the same place where Frank had proposed all those years ago, and they had made it a tradition to come here on important occasions. 30 years, Zelda said, shaking her head in wonder. It seems impossible that so much time has passed. 30 of the best years of my life, Frank said, and if I have my way, we will have 30 more. I will take whatever time we are given, Zelda said. As long as I have you, I will be grateful for every moment. They sat on the grass, Frank's arm around Zelda's shoulders, and watched the sun set over their land, over the life they had built together. In the distance, they could see Will and Sarah's house, where lights were beginning to come on as evening fell. They could see the barn where Frank had taught all 3 of their children to ride. They could see the chicken coops that had been Zelda's first successful business venture. Every inch of this land held memories, held love, held the evidence of their hard work and dedication. You ever think about how different our lives would have been if I had not stopped at that saloon that day? Frank asked. Sometimes, Zelda admitted, but not with regret. Everything that happened, both the hard times and the good times, brought us to where we are now, and I would not change a single thing. Not even the hard parts. The years of struggle, not even those. They taught us resilience. They taught us to value what we have. They taught us that we can face anything as long as we face it together. Frank kissed the top of Zelda's head. You have always been wiser than me. And you have always been kinder than you give yourself credit for, Zelda countered. You saw someone in need and you helped, without expecting anything in return. That is who you are, Frank Foster. That is the man I fell in love with and the man I am still in love with after 30 years. They stayed on that hill until the stars came out, talking and reminiscing, planning and dreaming. Even after 3 decades together, they never ran out of things to say to each other. Frank and Zelda lived to see all of their grandchildren grow up, and even lived to meet several great-grandchildren. They remained active and engaged with the ranch and their family well into their 70s, though they did eventually turn over the day-to-day operations to Will and his family. On a warm spring day in 1910, 52 years after they had first met, Frank passed away peacefully in his sleep, Zelda's hand in his. He was 77 years old, and he had lived a full, rich life surrounded by love. Zelda mourned him deeply, but she also took comfort in the knowledge that they had made the most of every day they had been given. They had loved well, lived well, and left a legacy of kindness and hard work that would continue through their children and grandchildren. Zelda lived for 3 more years after Frank's death, spending her time with her family, tending her garden, and writing down the stories of her life, so that future generations would know where they came from. She wrote about growing up in Paso Robles, about her father's death and her desperate years at the saloon, about the day a handsome cowboy had walked through the door and changed her life forever. She wrote about Frank's gentle nature and fierce protectiveness, about their courtship and wedding, about the ranch they had built from almost nothing. She wrote about their children and the joy they had brought, about the hard times and the good times, about the love that had sustained them through it all. On a beautiful October afternoon, surrounded by her children and many of her grandchildren, Zelda Crawford Foster closed her eyes for the last time. She was 76 years old, and she had lived a life beyond her wildest dreams. At her funeral, held in the same small church where she and Frank had married, person after person stood to speak about Zelda's kindness, her generosity, her strength. They spoke about how she had helped others, how she had built a successful business from nothing, how she had been a devoted wife and mother. But what they spoke about most was the love between Zelda and Frank, a love that had been legendary in the community, a love that had inspired others to believe that true partnership and devotion were possible. Zelda was buried beside Frank on the hill overlooking the ranch, the same place where he had proposed and where they had spent so many evenings watching the sunset. A simple stone marked their graves with an inscription that read, "Frank and Zelda Foster, partners in life, together forever." The ranch continued through the generations, each new owner adding their own touches while respecting the foundation that Frank and Zelda had built. The house was expanded again and again, but the original 4 rooms that Frank had built with his own hands were preserved, a reminder of where it all began. The story of how Frank and Zelda met became family legend, passed down from parent to child, each generation marveling at the courage it took for Zelda to accept help, and the kindness it took for Frank to offer it. The story of her hands, raw from scrubbing floors, and how Frank had kissed them and said, "No more serving," became a symbol of the transformative power of love and the importance of seeing the worth in every person. Great-great-grandchildren who never knew Frank and Zelda still visited their graves, still felt the presence of their love in the land they had built, still told their stories with pride and gratitude. The ranch that had started with 200 acres and a small 4-room house had grown into a sprawling operation, but it never lost the heart that Frank and Zelda had given it. And on quiet evenings, when the sun set over the California hills and the wildflowers bloomed in the spring, those who were sensitive to such things swore they could still see 2 figures on the hillside, sitting close together, holding hands, watching the sunset over the life they had built. Some said it was just the light playing tricks, shadows, and memories, but others knew better. They knew that love like Frank and Zelda's did not end with death. It lived on in the land they had tended, in the family they had raised, in the legacy of kindness and hard work they had left behind. The story of Zelda Crawford, who had been broken and hopeless, scrubbing floors with bleeding hands in a saloon, and Frank Foster, the wandering cowboy who had seen her worth when she could not see it herself, became more than just a family story. It became a reminder that one act of kindness could change a life, that love could heal even the deepest wounds, that it was never too late for a second chance. And in the hearts of all who knew their story, Frank and Zelda Foster lived on, eternal proof that sometimes, just sometimes, fairy tales did come true, even in the hard, dusty reality of the California Wild West. Their love had started with a simple act of compassion, a cowboy who refused to walk past a woman in pain, who kissed her damaged hands and promised her that her days of serving were over. And that love had grown into something beautiful and lasting, something that had rippled out through generations, touching countless lives, proving that the greatest legacy anyone could leave was not wealth or fame, but love given freely and received with gratitude. In the end, that was the true story of Frank and Zelda Foster, not just a tale of hardship overcome or dreams achieved, but a testament to the power of 2 people choosing each other every single day through joy and sorrow, through triumph and struggle, until death and even beyond. Their hands, once raw from labor, had joined together to build something extraordinary. Their hearts, once lonely and searching, had found their home in each other. And their love, tested by time and circumstance, had proved strong enough to last not just a lifetime but forever.